Hello, my friends. Welcome to Hope for Your Heart. This is Pastor Calvin Corbett. So happy to have you joining me today for part 2 that we've entitled Peace with My Painful Past. From time to time, we all need a reset, and that's what we're talking about today, how to have a reset in your life. Well, just in case you missed yesterday's broadcast, we talked about the fact that you have to look back in order to move forward. We're told to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. Don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And so as we look in our past, we're looking in our past for some key points. Number one, we're looking into our past so we can have wisdom so that we know how to live in the present. You know the mistakes that you made yesterday, they're in your past, leave them in your past, but learn from those mistakes. Don't repeat those mistakes. Secondly, we look at the past so that we can remember what God did. I remember numerous times that God has bailed me out of major problems, right? And I've had some legal problems that I thought were going to be doing me in, but God delivered me, right? When I think about how God has come through every single time, you can trust Him. He will come, and He will come through at just the right moment. And then number 3, we look at our past, not only to gain wisdom, not only to see where God has taken care of us, but also that we can move ahead. Well, the past shapes our present. The Bible also urges us to press forward. Paul says, forget what lies behind and reach toward what lies ahead. We're called to embrace God's plan for the future. As you look back at life, you realize that God will come through if you trust in Him. Now, I'm going to give you some cautions about looking back. We've covered a couple of them yesterday. Let me quickly repeat the first couple of them. Number one caution about the past is that it can trap me, right? I can get stuck in a rut. You think about those who cannot forgive somebody. They get trapped, right? And the trapping that they've experienced, their personal entrapment, is much greater than the offense that took place. So remembering the good old days is good to a certain degree, but don't get trapped in the past. Secondly, we said, as we look at our past, oftentimes we can become filled with pride. Look what I've done. You know, Paul in Philippians 3, now this is after he wrote the book of Corinthians. Philippians was written toward the end of Paul's life. He's in a Roman jail, and either in a Roman jail or under house arrest. And he's writing this epistle to the Philippian believers. And he says, the things that were gained to me, those I counted lost. Now, Paul was an amazing rabbi. He was a teacher of the law. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He was an amazing dude. He was a leader. He was one of these guys who thought he was doing God a big favor, thought he was carrying out God's will by persecuting the church. He thought that this new Christianity, this new Christian sect, the people that call themselves the people of the way, he thought they were not from God. And so he thought the best thing he could do is to eradicate and persecute these individuals, right? And then he had his conversion experience. When he came to Christ, he realized all the things that he thought were gain, those he counted as lost. So be careful about looking at your past because it can fill you with pride. And there's a third caution as you look at your past, and that it can make me bitter. In Ruth chapter 1, we have the amazing account of a couple who were believing couple, Naomi and Elimelech. And they were during the days of the judges, right? That's when they lived. They lived in Bethlehem in Judea. And Bethlehem, the name Bethlehem means bread basket or blessing of a bread basket. Bethlehem was known for its ability to grow wheat and to grow other great crops that would be the bread basket of the world. But a famine was in the land. So Naomi decided to move with her husband Elimelech to a place in Moab. Now, they should have probably stayed right where they were, right? I mean, God takes care of our needs. We don't just leave because we have a need that's not met, unless God leads us to leave. And so Elimelech and his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they moved from Bethlehem to Moab. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, after they're there for a while, he dies. And then she's left there with her two sons. These two sons married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and without her husband. And so here we discover that as we fast forward the story, Naomi is thinking, well, maybe it's time that I move back to Bethlehem, go back to my people, and there's nothing here in Moab anymore to keep me here. So she tells her two daughter-in-laws that I'm heading on back. I'm going to go back to my home country, and you stay here, and you find husbands here, but I'm leaving. And so I'm going back to my family. I'm going back to my home country. Well, both Orpah and Ruth says, hey, we'll go with you, right? We'd love to go back with you. But, Naomi really tries to talk them out of it. But they both said, no, we're going to go with you. Well, just before Naomi heads back, Orpah has a change of mind, and she decides not to go with Ruth and with Naomi. She decides to stay in Moab. But Ruth goes. As a matter of fact, Ruth is so insistent on going. She says something that is often used in wedding ceremonies. Ruth said to her mother-in-law, Naomi, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you go, I will go. A powerful connection between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. Amazing when you think about it. So they head on back into Bethlehem, and as they're coming into Bethlehem, Naomi meets some of the elders in the city, and they immediately recognize her. But notice the first thing that she says, and this is found in verse 20 of Ruth 1. She says, don't call me Naomi. She told them, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Now, isn't it interesting she uses that word Mara? It's the same word that Moses used to describe the bitter water in the wilderness. It was Mara. It was bitter. It was brackish water that could not be drunk because it was bitter. It says, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Naomi, she looks back over her life and she says, my life hasn't turned out very good. I've lost my husband. I've lost my two sons. I've got nothing to show for my life. My life is bitter. But as you look at your past, don't let your past make you bitter. Let it make you better. You may have had a bitter past, but don't let that define you. Don't let that trap you. You may have had some setbacks, but I have found that setbacks are really setups for God to propel us in the next direction in our lives, to take that next step in our lives. I mean, after all, if I never had a problem, I wouldn't know that He could solve them. And so as you look at your past, realize that there might have been some bitter times, but God was with me. God was with me every step of the way. There's another caution of looking into your past. I said caution as we look at your past. Caution number one is that it can trap you, the good old days. Caution number two is the fact that it can fill me with pride. Look what I've done. Look at my past. Look at my predicate. Look at my credentials. It can make me bitter. And next, number four, it can be twisted. Paul says, I don't consider that I've made it on my own, but one thing I do, I forget what lies behind and I strain forward to what lies ahead. Now, I'm glad he put that straining forward to what lies ahead, because it's much more difficult to strain forward to the future than it is to fall back into the past. We may not want to admit it, but Arthur Brooks is convincing. when he writes about the effects of age-related decline. Again, this is one of the cautions of looking back, is that our past can be twisted. Sometimes we make excuses for ourselves that we can't recall names. Just the other day, I was at Sam's Club, and I don't usually go to the Sam's Club in Virginia Beach, right on Virginia Beach Boulevard. I usually go to the one in Greenbrier, but I was out in Virginia Beach, and I had somebody with me, and I had my grandson with me. And so the guy that was with me says, "Hey, why don't we just go to the Sam's Club right here? We're right close to it anyway." And I said, "Okay, Sam's Club is Sam's Club is Sam's Club." And so I said, "Sure, we'll go there." And so as we go in there, I'm walking down the aisle, and my grandson in the cart, and this guy walking with me. I ran into somebody that I knew, and I began talking to them. And, for the life of me, I could not remember this person's name. I knew exactly who this person was, but I couldn't recall the person's name. And I later said to the person that was with me, I said, "I'm sorry that I didn't introduce you, but I wasn't trying to be rude, but I says, I could not for the life of me remember the name of the person that I was talking to." And you know what happened? As soon as I walked away from that person, I remembered their name. Does that happen to you? By the time that you are 50, your brain is as crowded with information as the New York Public Library. Meanwhile, your personal research librarian is creaky, slow, and easily distracted. When you send him off to get some information that you need, say somebody's name, he takes a minute to stand up, stops for coffee, talks to an old friend in the periodical section, and then he forgets where he was going in the first place. You ever have that happen to you? You walk in the room to get something, and you say, "Why did I come into this room?" Well, meanwhile, you're kicking yourself for forgetting something that you have known for years. That's kind of what happens with our memory, unfortunately. And now you can do some things to help alleviate that, right? You can do some memory games. You can have a healthier diet. Exercising your brain actually helps it to remember better. But when we look at our past, it's so easy, if we're not careful, to twist the past, to make it worse than it really was, or to make it better than it really was. So that's a caution of looking in the past. There's one final caution that we have when we look at our past. Our past can detour me or deter me, right, from doing what God has called me to do. Jesus ran into this problem with some of the people that he asked to follow him. Now, to be a disciple of Christ doesn't mean you just know a bunch of information about him. It's not just studying the Bible and studying the Savior. It's actually following him. So Jesus said to a man one day, "Follow me." But the man said, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." Now, Jesus knew exactly what this man was doing. He was coming up with an excuse. It's not that it's wrong to go bury your father, but this man was being detoured by his affairs with burying his father. So Jesus said to him, "Leave the dead to bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." You see, even in the midst of burying your dead, you can still proclaim the kingdom of God. You can still be a follower of Christ. Don't compartmentalize your life so much that you say, "Okay, I need to have this time over here, and I'm going to take a little detour for a little while." No, be focused, right? Sometimes people say, "Well, because of my past, I can't do all that God's called me to do. I didn't have the advantages that other people have had. I didn't have the breaks that other people have. I don't have the intellect that other people have." Don't let your past detour you. So Jesus went to another and he said, "Follow me." But this man said, "Lord, first let me go say farewell to those who are at my home," right? Now we think, well, there's nothing wrong with saying goodbye to your family. But this man was using this as a detour, right? Not to follow the Lord. He was going to have an extended time with his family. In other words, his family came first. He was worshiping his family. Everything was about his family. You got to be careful when you look at your past that you don't let it deter you. There's a story of Lot's wife. remember Lot's wife. You know the story, right? God is looking down and he sees the deplorable condition of humanity. He gives his plans to Abraham. So now, Abraham, the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah has come to me. He wasn't looking for that evil, but it has come to me. And so Abraham's given some insight. That's what God's going to do. God's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But Abraham intercedes on behalf of Lot and the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says, now, Lord, would you spare Sodom and Gomorrah if I could find 50 righteous people? You know, God is always a God of mercy. His first position is grace and mercy. His first position is not judgment and punishment, right? That's almost like, okay, you've pushed me far enough, and enough is enough. And we all understand this, right? We understand there's a certain point where judgment must rule and judgment must take place, right? I mean, if you're sitting in a place and somebody walks in and starts shooting everybody up, you wouldn't say, well, we just need to love that guy. We just need to support that guy. We need to understand that his way of doing things is a little different than our way of doing things. But who's to say what's right and what's wrong? No, we're going to say judgment must take place, right? And God operates the same way with us. And so Abraham says, well, you know, Lord, I couldn't find 50. How about 40? No, couldn't find 40. How about 30? How about 20? How about 10? God even agrees to save Sodom and Gomorrah if they could find 10 people that were righteous. Well, they couldn't even find 10 people. And so God says, judgment's going to fall. But even before judgment falls, he gives Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters a chance to get out of that city before destruction takes place. Now, as they're leaving the city, it says that Lot's wife turned back to the city, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. You see, when you look at your past, if you're not careful, it can deter you. Now, there are 3 skills that I want to share with you for a healthy relationship and knowing how to deal with your past. I'm going to look at Matthew 26, verses 36 to 46. This is at a point in Jesus' ministry where he's about finished his earthly ministry, and he's with his disciples, and they're at a place called Gethsemane. And Jesus had an inner circle, and he had 3 in his inner circle, Peter, James, and John. And Jesus is at the point where he's about to be betrayed. He's about to be crucified. He knows that his time is near. So at this most grievous time in his life, he goes into the garden and he wants to pray. He brings Peter, James, and John with him. And as they're going there, he says, you know, guys, I want you to know that I'm troubled and I'm sorrowful. He says, my soul is overwhelmed, even with sorrow to the point of death. Now, this is where Jesus is beginning to sweat great drops of blood toward the end of this time in the garden. And so he says to these 3, I want you to stay right here, and I'm going to go on a little further, but I want you to keep watch and pray. So Jesus goes a little further, and as he goes, he falls on his face, he falls to the ground, and he prays, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Now, I believe as Jesus is giving his prayer, he's not praying that he would get out of going to Calvary or get out of going to the crucifixion. I think what he's praying is that, Lord, I think I'm dying right here in this garden of a broken heart. If it be your will, let me miss this so I can make it to the cross. Jesus goes back to his disciples. And what does he do? He finds them sleeping. And he asks them a question when he wakes them up. He says, couldn't you keep watch with me for an hour? Now, you ever been there? You're at a desperate point in your life and you call somebody and say, hey, can you come over? And, oh, man, I'm too tired right now. I'm too busy right now. And can I come tomorrow, right? And it's like, can't you just hang out with me for an hour? I am devastated in my life right now. That's what Jesus is feeling, the fact that not only his closest friends were there to support him. So Jesus gives another instruction. He said, okay, I'm going to go pray again and just watch and pray, okay? Okay, Jesus, we'll stay up this time. And he comes back a second time and says, now, Father, if it's possible for this cup to be taken away from me, unless I drink it, your will be done. He goes back. He finds them sleeping again because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and he went away once more and he prayed a third time, praying the same thing. Then he returned to his disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinner. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Now, when you think about this whole context, now, I don't want to be too hard on Peter, James, and John because the flesh is weak. As a matter of fact, Jesus gives Peter specifically a very stark warning. He said, now, Peter, watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Not too much longer after this, Peter denies the Lord 3 times. The spirit was willing, but his flesh was very weak. So when we look at how Jesus handled his relationships, there's 3 things that he had lined up, right? First of all, in his own person, he kept watch. Jesus knew the importance of praying. Now, if the perfect Son of God knew that he needed to pray, how much more do we need to pray? As highly flawed as we are, we need to keep watch and we need to pray, because if we don't, we're going to fall into temptation. The spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. We fight battles on our knees. We have that ability to overcome temptation by praying. Keep watch. Jesus did something else. He acknowledged his grief. He says, my soul's overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And so he says, stay here and keep watch. So Jesus here is acknowledging his grief. He's not denying it. He's not saying, hey, I don't have any grief. It's okay. And then it says he fell on his face, he prayed, and he persisted. So Jesus dealt with his person. Secondly, Jesus dealt with his people. Now look at what he does. When he's at this point of great need, he involves others. He wasn't dependent upon them, right? This wasn't a codependent relationship, but he invited them to share his time of grief. He invited them to share a time of watching and praying. And he did something else. He did something that a lot of times we're afraid to do, right? He confronted them. He confronted them with the fact that they couldn't even pray for an hour. They fell asleep. On 3 occasions, they fell asleep. And then he warns them. And he warns them that if they don't get a hold of this watching and praying, they're going to be giving into temptation over and over and over again. So Jesus had his person dealt with in the right way. He knew how to deal with his people. And then number 3, he dealt with his problems. He persisted. He went a second time. He went a third time. He persisted in praying. Why? Because he was totally surrendered to God's will. You see, that's the key of living a successful life, living at peace, realizing that I've always got to bring it back to Jesus. I've always got to bring my past to Jesus. I got to bring my present to Jesus. I got to trust my future to Jesus. All the problems that we can possibly encounter, give them over to the Lord. Well, thank you for joining me today. I'd love to pray for you. And I would pray that God would give you that peace that passes all understanding. Maybe you're struggling with something in your past and you need to be set free. Would you shoot me a text message and I'll pray for you? This is Pastor Calvin. Text me at 252-267-2365. 252-267-2365. I'd love to pray for you, lift you up on behalf of my Lord and Savior, praying that He will deliver you, praying that He will give you the capacity to keep watch, praying that as you look at your past, you don't get stuck in a rut, that you don't become filled with pride, that you can use your past as a wonderful learning example of how to do better in the future, as a wonderful opportunity to remember all that God did. I'm so glad that God was with me in the past and be with me in the future. He'll be with me forevermore. He's never going to leave me, never forsake me. Well, listen, God can take care of your greatest needs. I know He can. That number one more time, if you'd like to shoot me a text, is 252-267-2365. God bless you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to pray that God gives you the strength to mount up with wings as eagles as you run and not be weary. God bless you for listening today. If you'd like to hear this broadcast again, you can have a free download at buzzsprout.com/1890557, or you can listen on Amazon, Spotify, Google Podcast, and Apple Podcast.
Hickory Ridge Community Church is located at 3320 Battlefield Boulevard South in Chesapeake, Virginia. Sunday service times are 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. We'd love for you to join us. For more information, go to hrcc7.org. And remember, no matter what you're going through, in Jesus Christ there is always hope for your heart.